May 12th, 1945, Wiesbaden, Germany. The artillery had stopped 3 days ago, but 19-year-old Ilse Hartmann still flinched at sudden sounds. She stood in the rubble of what used to be her father's pharmacy, searching for anything salvageable, when she heard the trucks. American trucks. Her mother grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise. "Stay behind me," she hissed. "Don't look at them. Don't speak." Everything Ilse had been taught said this moment would be the worst of her life. But when the convoy stopped and soldiers stepped down from the vehicles, Ilse froze. They weren't what she'd been told to expect. These American soldiers were black. The propaganda posters had shown white Americans as gangsters and criminals. But black soldiers? The Nazi education system had taught her they were barely human, subhuman, dangerous, savage. Every word her teachers used made them sound like monsters. The lead soldier, a sergeant with kind eyes and corporal stripes, approached slowly. He held up both hands, showing they were empty. Then he said in broken German, "We have food. Medicine. You need help?" Ilse's entire world cracked down the middle, because the voice that spoke those words was gentle, and everything she'd been taught said that was impossible. But before we dive deeper into this incredible untold story that history tried to bury, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. The 761st Tank Battalion rolled into Western Germany like a ghost that shouldn't exist. The Black Panthers, they called themselves. Combat veterans who'd fought through France with a ferocity that earned them a unit commendation. Behind them came the 92nd Infantry Division, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, and dozens of other segregated black units that America had sent to fight but never quite acknowledged. For German civilians, especially women who'd been taught to fear Americans, the first encounters with black soldiers created a cognitive dissonance so profound it shattered decades of indoctrination in minutes. Ilse Hartmann had spent her entire education learning racial hierarchy. The Aryan race at the top, other Europeans below, and at the very bottom, black people. Subhuman, the textbook said, incapable of civilization, culture, or reason. Her teacher, Frau Drescher, had been particularly emphatic. "If you ever encounter a Negro," she'd said during a racial science class in 1942, "remember they are driven by base instincts. They cannot control themselves. They are dangerous animals in human form." Ilse had believed her. Why wouldn't she? Frau Drescher was a teacher, an authority, someone you trusted. But now, standing in the ruins of Wiesbaden, with her mother's fingernails digging into her arm, Ilse watched the sergeant carefully set down a crate of sea rations. He stepped back immediately, giving them space. Another soldier, younger, maybe 20, placed a jerry can of clean water beside him. Then they retreated to their vehicles and waited. "It's a trap," Ilse's mother whispered. "They're testing us, seeing if we're desperate enough." But Ilse's younger brother, only 7 years old and hollow-cheeked from hunger, broke away and ran to the crate. The soldiers didn't move, didn't shout. The sergeant just nodded and pointed at the food, making an eating gesture. That night, Ilse sat in their cellar eating tinned meat and crackers while her mother wept. "I don't understand," her mother kept saying. "I don't understand." Neither did Ilse, but the cognitive dissonance had only just begun. In the town of Babenhausen, 28-year-old Margaret Schiller had a different first encounter. She'd been hiding in a farmhouse with 5 other women, all of them terrified, when a patrol from the 761 Tank Battalion discovered them. The moment they heard boots on the stairs, the women huddled together, praying. They'd heard stories from refugees fleeing the Eastern Front. Russian soldiers, they said, showed no mercy. Margaret assumed Americans would be the same. When the door opened and Margaret saw the soldier's face, her first thought was that she was hallucinating from hunger. Black skin, American uniform. The contradiction made no sense in her worldview. In Nazi Germany, black people didn't exist as real entities. They were theoretical bogeymen, images in propaganda, warnings about the dangers of racial mixing in American society. The soldier, Corporal James Thompson from Detroit, saw the terror in their eyes and immediately backed out of the room. He called down to his lieutenant, and within minutes, a German-speaking interpreter arrived. The interpreter, a Jewish refugee who'd escaped to America in 1938, stood in the doorway and said, "You are not prisoners. You are civilians. We need to check that you're not wounded. Then we'll leave you alone." Margaret watched Thompson's face during this exchange. He looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed, like he knew exactly what they'd been taught to think about him. Later, she would remember that expression and feel a shame so deep it became physical. The 92nd Infantry Division, an entirely black unit, except for white officers, established occupation zones throughout southern Germany. For women in towns like Mannheim, Ludwigshafen, and Kaiserslautern, this meant their first extended contact with black Americans. In Mannheim, 31-year-old Gisela Werner worked as a translator for the occupation authorities. She'd learned English before the war, and despite her fear, she needed the job desperately. Her first day, she was assigned to help facilitate food distribution. The officer in charge was Lieutenant Marcus Washington, a lawyer from Chicago. Gisela couldn't stop staring, not from curiosity, but from trying to reconcile reality with everything she'd learned. Washington was educated, articulate, professional. He spoke about international law and humanitarian obligations. He quoted the Geneva Convention from memory. Every minute she spent in his presence demolished another piece of her indoctrination. During a break, Washington noticed her discomfort. "Ma'am," he said quietly in careful German, "I know what you were taught about people who look like me. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter. But I need you to translate accurately, and I need you to treat the people we're helping with dignity. Can you do that?" Gisela nodded, unable to speak. Later that night, she wrote in her diary, "Everything was a lie. Everything. How many other lies was I told?" The cognitive dissonance operated on multiple levels. First, there was the shock of encountering black soldiers at all. Most German women had never seen a black person in their lives. The Reich had fewer than 20,000 black residents before the war, mostly in major cities, and most had been persecuted or killed. Second, there was the behavior of the soldiers themselves. They weren't savage. They weren't uncontrolled. They followed rules, showed discipline, demonstrated education and competence. One woman from Stuttgart, Anna Koch, described in a 1946 interview, "I expected animals. I found men who were more civilized than our own soldiers had been." The third level was the kindness. Despite knowing what German women had been taught, despite understanding the depths of racist indoctrination they'd received, many black soldiers responded with generosity that seemed incomprehensible. In the town of Pforzheim, largely destroyed by Allied bombing, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion set up medical aid stations. Medic Samuel Johnson from Alabama found himself treating German civilians who flinched when he approached. He worked carefully, explaining each action, giving them space to retreat if they needed to. One elderly woman, Frau Holzmann, spat at him during treatment. Johnson cleaned the wound on her leg anyway, bandaged it properly, and gave her antibiotics from his limited supply. He said nothing about the incident. The next day, Frau Holzmann returned with her granddaughter. She apologized in broken English. Johnson accepted with a simple nod. Years later, the granddaughter, Lotte Holzmann, would say, "My grandmother cried for 3 days after that. She said she'd spent her whole life believing lies, and now she would spend the rest of her life trying to make amends." The marriages began within months. Despite fraternization rules, despite military prohibitions, despite the horror of both American military police and German communities, relationships formed. In Bavaria alone, records show over 150 marriages between black American servicemen and German women by late 1946. These weren't simple romances. Each relationship represented a complete rejection of Nazi racial ideology. For the women, choosing to marry a black soldier meant accepting that everything they'd been taught was not just wrong, but catastrophically, criminally wrong. Ilse Hartmann, the pharmacist's daughter from Wiesbaden, married Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell of the 761 Tank Battalion in 1947. Her mother disowned her. Her former neighbors called her a traitor. But Ilse said in a letter to her sister, "I would rather be a traitor to lies than remain loyal to the evil I was taught." The children of these marriages, the occupation babies, faced brutal discrimination in Germany. Many were eventually adopted by their fathers' families in America. But their existence proved something the Nazi regime had spent enormous effort denying: that humanity transcends the false categories racism creates. The psychological impact on German women who encountered black soldiers with preconceived notions from Nazi propaganda often followed a pattern. First came shock at the disconnect between expectation and reality. Then came shame as they recognized their indoctrination. Finally came a broader questioning of everything they'd been taught. Margaret Schiller, who'd hidden in the farmhouse, became a vocal anti-racism advocate in post-war Germany. She spoke at schools about her experience, beginning every talk the same way. "I was taught to hate. I was taught to fear. And then I met actual human beings, and everything I'd been taught revealed itself as a lie designed to make monsters of us all." Not every encounter was positive. Some black soldiers, embittered by segregation in their own military and racism in their own country, showed little patience for German civilians. Some German women, too committed to their indoctrination, refused to acknowledge reality even when it stood in front of them. But the majority of encounters followed the pattern Ilse Hartmann experienced: expectation of savagery, followed by the slow, uncomfortable realization that the savagery existed not in the soldiers they'd been taught to fear, but in the system that taught them to fear. The irony wasn't lost on many black soldiers. They'd been fighting to defeat a racist regime while serving in a segregated military from a country that still practiced Jim Crow. Lieutenant Washington told Gisela Werner during one of their working sessions, "We're here to defeat your racism while being forced to live with our own. It's absurd. Someday, both our countries will have to face what they've done." By 1948, as occupation duties wound down and black units returned home, they left behind changed communities. The women who'd worked with them, married them, or simply encountered them, carried forward a truth: that the racial hierarchies they'd been taught were constructs, lies designed to control and dehumanize. Ilse Mitchell, formerly Hartmann, wrote to her sister in 1963 after seeing news coverage of the March on Washington, "When I see Dr. King speak, I think about Robert and the other men from his unit. They fought a racist empire abroad, then went home to fight racism in their own country. They taught me that courage means confronting the lies you were raised to believe. That's the lesson I'll carry until I die." German children born after the war learned a different history than their parents. The cognitive dissonance their mothers experienced became teaching moments. When Lotte Holtzmann had children of her own, she told them about the black medic who treated her grandmother with kindness despite being spat upon. "Your great-grandmother learned the hardest lesson," Lotte would say, "that the people you're taught to hate are often more human than the people who teach you to hate." The occupation archives contained thousands of small moments like these: medical treatment given to hostile civilians, food shared despite resentment, professional courtesy extended even when met with racist contempt. Each moment was a hammer blow against the ideology of supremacy. The lasting impact wasn't measured in military victories or territory controlled. It was measured in the women who chose to question everything they'd been taught, in the children who grew up hearing their mothers say, "I was wrong. We were all wrong," in the slow, painful process of recognizing that humanity cannot be divided into hierarchies of worth. For the black soldiers themselves, the experience was complex. They'd been treated with more respect by former enemy civilians than by their own military. They'd proven their worth in combat, only to return home to a country that still denied them basic rights. The contradiction was bitter, but for the German women who encountered them, the soldiers represented an undeniable truth, that the Nazi regime had built itself on lies so fundamental, so all-encompassing, that recognizing one lie meant questioning everything. Ilse Mitchell's final letter to her sister, written in 1975, captured the transformation. I was 19 years old when I met Robert. I'd been taught my whole life that he was subhuman. Within 1 week of knowing him, I realized I was the one who'd been made less than human by believing such things. The education system, the propaganda, the teachers, they didn't just teach us to hate others. They taught us to destroy our own capacity for recognizing humanity. That's what I'll never forgive. The story of German women meeting Black American soldiers for the first time is ultimately a story about the fragility of indoctrination when confronted with reality. It's about the shock of recognition when propaganda meets actual human beings. And it's about the courage required to admit you were wrong about something so fundamental it shaped your entire worldview. These women carried that lesson forward. They raised children who questioned authority. They spoke at schools about the dangers of believing what you're taught without examining it. They became living proof that change is possible, that recognition of one's own indoctrination is the first step towards something better. History measures wars in battles, casualties, and territorial changes. But for these women, history was measured in the moment their certainty shattered. In the second they realized that the monsters they'd been warned about were more human than the system that warned them. That realization changed everything. Not immediately, not easily, but completely. And in the rubble of defeated Germany, among women who'd been taught to fear and hate, the simple act of treating others with dignity became the most revolutionary act of all.